Hello, everyone. I'm happy to participate in Design History Society seminar, Folk Cultures and Everyday Objects. Today, I will present you the result of my research, which I started as a Goldsmith student and hope will accomplish in the near future. The title of my presentation is Soap Cleansing Power, the role of soap branding in the process of establishment of the Russian Empire's colonial narrative in Ukraine. In my research, I seek to examine a specific phenomena in Ukrainian heritage culture, which local ethnographers called brocart embroidery. This is a specific pattern which became widely popular at the end of the 19th century and still remain deeply integrated in Ukrainian material culture. My objection is to illustrate how this specific pattern reflects colonial narrative of Russian Empire and the strategy of cultural homogenization of colonized people, in my case, Ukrainian. Let me start by explaining why I put on the first slide of my presentation such different images. On the right, you could see the cover of the book of feminist scholar Anne McClintock, which calls Imperial Leather, Race, Gender, and Sexuality in the Colonial Context. In this book, she examines how imperial narrative of the British Empire were embedded in brands and consumer culture of the end of the 19th century. She used specific term domesticated and focused her analysis on one of the popular commodity of the Victorian era, the soap. By using method of textual analysis of soap advertising through the lenses of feminist theory, she shows how the establishment of the cult of Victorian cleaning rituals express state official policy regarding race, class, and gender at the end of the 19th century. Even more, how gradually the perception of cleanliness has changed and the idea of the clean body shifted from physical to social one. That way, racism and gender inequality were spread and consumed alongside highly valuable and modern commodities. The process of domestication of the empire had not happened exclusively in Britain, but in countries I'm more familiar with, such as Ukraine, which in the 19th century was occupied by Russian Empire. The image on the left is an example of already mentioned brocart embroidery, and in my presentation I'm going to show how embroidery come to represent Russian colonial ambitions. Let's start with ambitions. The Russian Empire never portrayed itself as a colonial state. Nevertheless, it was. For sure, its colonial nature was quite different compared to the British, French, and Dutch empires. Russia was stretched over one Eurasia continent. It was not separated by great water of oceans and seas. While the number of cultural, religious, linguistic, and economic differences between periphery and a monopoly within Western Empire was significant, the situation was completely different in Russia. The linguistic similarity between Slavic population, as well as historical and political ties with non-Slavic, allowed to establish here a specific relationship within the Russian Empire, such as internal colonialism. Even in 17th century, Russia developed a specific narrative which covered up its colonial ambitions, instead of presenting it as one nation state of the great Russian population. All East Slavic ethnic groups were considered branches of all Russian nations, while the rest were blessed to belong to its state. One of the main strategies of the state was cultural homogenization of colonial subjects. It included not only glorification of one Russian culture, but also positioning of the local cultures as less developed with lack of greatness. There is another term which perfectly describes the situation: Russification, installment of the Russian language as primal within the state. By the end of the 19th century, Russification project was implemented in Ukraine with unseen cruelty. The teaching, maintaining documents, staging concerts in theater, publishing books in Ukrainian language were prohibited. That was a historical contest when the first perfumery factory was developed in Russian Empire, the Brocard factory, and the most successful product of it as a people soap was presented on the market. And it turns out that the best-selling product of the Brocard company made a great contribution to the unity of the empire. Brocard company was founded by French and Belgian entrepreneur Henry Brocard, and his commercial success came with invention and introduction of people soap in 1864. Because of technological development of innovative ingredient as a glycerin, the cost of the production has been significantly reduced. In retail, it cost just 1 kopeka, which was 20 or even 30 times cheaper than the products imported from France or produced locally. Due to Brocard, hygiene became accessible for the lower classes and to the periphery of the empire. With hygiene came culture, branded culture. Brocard was one of the first in the empire to sell beauty products under the brand name with the logo in the style of the coat of arms. Brocard packaging was noticeable and attractive. His people soap was remarkable not only as a technical invention, but as a case of one of the most successful marketing campaigns at the end of the 19th century. To sell the soap all over the Russian Empire, the entrepreneur used a successful advertisement move. Each piece of soap was supplied with printed postcard called premia, which might be translated as bonus, with simplifying patterns of flowers and sort of exotic embroidery. It was ideally targeted to the main audience, which was women who live in cities and villages and decorated clothes and household textiles by themselves. The product has multiple benefits. As a soap, it provides hygiene. With a bonus, with a printed postcard, it was sort of craft manual, and it has also an emotional benefit because soap was distributed on the small and big markets all over Europe and mostly was bought as a present. So it has this flavor of emotional positivity as a gift. Still, the patterns, which was widely distributed on the Brocard bonus printed card, were perceived sometimes as Western, but definitely non-authentic one. Mostly they were commissioned by Brocard from local illustrators. Some of them had clear reference of trendy styles of those times, such as neo-Gothic or Art Nouveau. But most of the pattern features more familiar to the local customers, roses and cornflowers, and the aesthetic was much more appealing and much more far from the folkloric tradition. Not to mention that the cross-stitched technique was widespread in Western Europe, not in Ukraine. There were more than 250 distinct embroidery stitches in Ukrainian culture, which were performed by more than 20 techniques. And even more important, each region was different by type of the ornament. And ethnographers in Ukraine called this particular type of the ornament, which was become popular on the Brocard premia printed postcard, specifically like that. Even though similar ornaments were spreading through women magazines and cheap printed production, the massive popularity of this cross-stitching roses flowers printed ornament is definitely attributed to the success of the People Soap campaign. Significantly, Brocard soap was distributed all over the Russian Empire. It was distributed alongside with the printed patterns. So the patterns of the embroidery were similar for the Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. It was not deliberately targeted for different countries. It was similar quite the opposite. And the fact they were replaced with the authentic one greatly contribute to the strategy of cultural homogenization, which the imperial state deliberately provided in Ukraine. If I may compare, in the world of domestic craft, brocade embroidery was the same as Russification and culture. It is quite hard to provide exact reason why those patterns become more popular, because there is no available data which was gathered on the field. We might guess because of newness, brightness, or even easiness of the production. Brocade, to perform brocade embroidery was less in terms of consuming time than the authentic one. But explanation might come from the field of fashion studies. Fashion in the era of modernity was developed and is still developing under two opposite tendencies. While wearing the latest fashion was a part of the city life, as well as certain appetite for trends and newness, it also required skills of the dissimulation in the city, to look like the others, to be part of the public. This ambiguity was part of the brocade patterns too. While people who receive those printed patterns were encouraged to experiment with the embroidery at a certain level and express personality or taste, at the same time, patterns remained recognizable and similar in techniques and visual impression. Even though the brocade company was closed after the Russian Revolution in 1917, it remained a part of cultural production for 20th century. Brocade patterns were successfully inherited by the USSR and become a dominated ornament of the folk ensembles. Nowadays, a lot of Ukrainians consider this ornament as authentic and original because of the long history of its presence in material culture. Still, it is a case of debates of authenticity. The ethnographers from Ukrainian Ivan Gonchar Museum, whose archival images I'm widely used in my presentation, express their attitude toward brocade patterns as less interesting for study compared to more authentic examples. And it is a perfect example of the tension which still exists in nowadays Ukraine, while the majority of population perceives those roses, cross-stitched black and white, red roses as original. The ethnographers don't consider it as authentic. And this tension and this tension is perfectly illustrate how effectively the narrative of the colonial state, the narratives which was distributed not directly to the customers, but through the commodities, through the advertisement, how successfully they were installed even in heritage culture, which considered one of the stable, one of the conservative and less influenced by other tendencies. And well, that is the end of my soap opera.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. And so sorry about the slides. If you'll be happy to, if Play comes back, we can just share it on the chat and people can go for the slides that you so brilliantly described to us. I'm so sorry about it, but your research is so fascinating. I think Eva is going to share her screen with us with the slides, so hopefully there will be no problems. So our next speaker is Eva Pigozone, who is a dress historian working at the Institute of Latvian History, University of Latvia. She researches traditional Latvian peasants' dress of the 18th and 19th century, as well as usage of folk dress in the politics and social life of the 20th and 21st century. She is the author of 2 monographs on Latvian dress history and more than 20 scientific articles. She gives public lectures on dress and culture history in Latvia and the Baltic region. Eva Pigozne is currently working on her 3rd monograph on the development of peasants' dress in Eastern Latvia in the 19th century. So over to you.
Thank you. I got the message that the host doesn't let me to share.
Okay. I think
maybe you can change it.
I think Claire is in the meeting and I'm not the host. I think she is. So I'm so sorry about this. Let me figure this out. Okay, I think Claire is still in the meeting, which means I can't change the settings. If you don't mind maybe emailing me the slides, because Claire has all of them, and then I can share it on the chat and you can just talk through your research. I am so sorry about the inconvenience. Technology is not on our side today. But hopefully later on in the presentation there shouldn't be any more problems.
Is there a share screen button at the bottom of your Zoom? 'Cause
Yeah.
there's one on mine.
Yeah, I've got that.
Yes,
but,
there is, but it doesn't work.
Oh, it's not working for you.
because the host only has the option that they can share it, and Claire is the host.
Oh dear.
Not ideal. I'm so sorry. So the previous 3 sessions went too smoothly. This one had to be the one with issue with some issues.
I just mailed you my presentation.
Okay,
maybe.
great.
But if you are not the host and you are not allowed to share it, maybe it doesn't help anyway.
Oh, that's true. That is very true. I have the option to share it, but I've not got your email yet. Oh, I just got it. Okay. Okay, I'm going to show you the screen because for some reason it is letting me to do that.
Excellent.
Can you see my screen?
Yes. You
Great.
could just make it presentation mode and then it's fine.
Yeah, I did that. Can you see it fine?
Excellent. Yes, thank
Okay,
you so
great,
much.
great.
Yeah.
So you can go ahead with your research.
Okay, my topic today is intersection of folk forms and modern objects, example of Latvian bridal crowns. And today I will focus on one element of the traditional Latvian dress, namely a crown. A crown is a ring-shaped head ornament that served no practical purpose. It was worn as a purely decorative element that could have some symbolic meaning. And as I am a dress historian, I must start with history. Metal and textile crowns were worn by all adult Baltic women between the 6th and the 17th centuries. You can see 2 such examples on the top row of this slide. The first crown is made of textile and embroidered with glass beads. The second consists of 2 different metal crowns made of brass spirals. In the 18th and 19th century, crowns became the exclusive head ornaments of unmarried young girls. Crowns were usually made of textile decorated with glass beads. In the first half of the 19th century, the tradition of wearing an embroidered textile crown for festival occasions started to decrease. In the second half of the 19th century, when traditional dress was gradually substituted by European town fashion, the only crowns that were still worn were bridal crowns. As you can see from the examples on the right side of the bottom row, bridal crowns were usually made of textile or paper flowers, metal ornaments, or glass beads and glass bubbles. Can we have the next slide, please? When traditional dress was no longer worn daily or for festival occasions, The idea of folk costumes appeared as the choir singers needed to have costumes for their performances. Wearing folk costumes became more and more popular, reaching its peak in the 1930s. Not only the choir singers wore folk costumes at that time, but also many people acquired a costume for festive use. This practice was actively promoted and marketed by ethnic culture and history activists, as well as the political leaders who used folk costumes for nationalistic propaganda. The process of promoting wearing folk costumes went hand in hand with promoting national values in the art and media. The most iconic was an image of a young girl in a folk costume wearing a crown. Looking at the narratives of the activists, politicians, artists, as well as the scholars, it can be observed that in the symbolism of the folk costume, the crown was the strongest symbol of all. Probably only the skirt could sometimes compete with it. The crown symbolizes purity and innocence, obeying and respecting traditional values, such virtues of young girls as hard work, honor, and beauty. This symbolism can be found in the folklore texts and historical records. At the same time, this symbolism in the 1930s was extended to adding also Latvianness and patriotism. These last two values were not attached to the crowns during the time when they were part of the people's festive attire in the 19th century. During the Soviet occupation, the wearing of folk costumes stuck to this extended tradition, but in a transformed way. Wearing folk costumes was often used for Soviet propaganda, as it symbolized friendship of nations under the Russian wing and happy Latvians who lived happily together with all the other nationalities within the Soviet Union. After restoring independence in 1991, most of the pre-war narratives connected to wearing folk costumes were not questioned, as they represented the ideas from the pre-occupation period, and thus were not considered damaged by the Soviet rule. So they were just taken over. In this slide, we can see how wearing a folk costume and a crown has been part of the choir, dance, and folklore performances for more than 120 years. Most of these crowns are made based on the originals of the 19th century embroidered textile crowns that are stored in the museums. The last 13 years, however, have seen a rebirth of the bridal crowns and even more modern versions of them. So next slide, please. In 2009, Latvian-Australian artist Brigita Stroda created modern versions of Latvian traditional bridal crowns from the 18th and 19th century. They were courageous designs that provoked the public interest and sometimes also discussion. During the last 10 years, making of modern crowns has become more and more popular. The idea peaked its popularity in 2016 when a group of post-folk singers, tautumeitas, created the image of the modern folk girls. They wear modern versions of bridal crowns for all their performances and photo shoots, no matter how modern or sometimes even futuristic or post-apocalyptic their dresses are. Since then, many master classes of making such crowns have been organized all over Latvia, and many craftspeople make them for sale. Women of all ages and marital statuses may wear such crowns for festive occasions. The wearers of the bridal crowns in the 19th century were exclusively only brides, especially only brides who had not been married before, were not pregnant, or did not have children. Today, we see that all women want to wear crowns. Many workshops take place where a group of friends or work colleagues meet for making crowns for themselves. And yes, of course, ladies wear such crowns together with modern clothing for weddings, but also for traditional holidays, graduation parties, festive occasions, photo shoots, advertising, and just for feeling pretty. This does not have anything to do with wearing a folk costume or with the symbolism of a crown described earlier. The traditional forms of bridal crowns are hardly to be recognized, and the more this new tradition evolves, the more creative approaches have taken over. Today, calling the new creations crowns often is the only connection between the new forms and the initial tradition of the 18th and 19th centuries. At the same time, this connection secures popularity, public interest, and appreciation. It can be argued that willingness to create interpretations of crowns, purchase them, and wear them is present only because the original folk tradition of bridal crowns was so popular both in the 18th and 19th century, and during the 1930s when folk costumes became very fashionable for choir singers and individual wearers on festive occasions. People feel that the modern crowns provide some mythical connection to their roots, as well as express their femininity, but they choose to use only the form of the crown, not the historical content or the symbolism. Modern crowns with their individualized designs also fulfill the desire of many Latvian women to be creative and unique. It seems that abandoning the symbolism while uniting the background of traditional forms with modern approach and individual creativity has turned out to be the key to success and popularity of the modern Latvian crowns today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting, and the slides were all fine, so that's great. So if you have any comments or questions, just put them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the very end. Marie, are you okay with sharing your slides? Yes?
Let me see if I can make it work.
Or if not, then I'll try doing the same what I've just done with the other one.
Can you see my slides?
Yes, I can.
Yes, we can see.
Okay. Can you see my notes?
No, we can't see your notes, so I'll just introduce you. And then, so our next speaker is Marie Gasper-Hulvat, who is an associate professor of art history at Kent State University at Stark in Canton, Ohio, USA. Her research interests include early Stalinist art, visual culture, and exhibition practices, as well as the pedagogy of art history. She has published 2 chapters on early Soviet children's illustration with Bloomsbury in Childhood by Design and Constructing Race on the Borders of Europe. Her chapter on Pavel Kuznetsov's subtle rejection of Soviet racial categorization in his late 1920s paintings of Crimean and Caucasian laborers is forthcoming in the edited volume, Russian Orientalism, published by Manchester University Press. So over to you, Marie.
Thank you, Victoria. All right, so I'm going to talk about folk material culture in early Soviet children's books, and we're going to talk from the colonizer's perspective. Although what I'm going to look at here is a series of several picture books that were published between 1926 and 1929 in Moscow and Leningrad. These picture books, they visually delineated ethnographic types of folk children, Diety Narodov, which is what you see the title, several of them here. And these illustrations provided paradigmatic examples of children from nations within and beyond the Soviet Union. And it's a very interesting moment in time because, oh, I forgot to start my timer. Let me start my timer so I don't go over 10 minutes. It's an interesting moment in time because we see at this moment in Soviet history, artists, intellectuals, a whole slew of ethnographers, a slew of different forces within the new Soviet era trying to grapple with the legacies of Russian imperialism in a more, what they want to think of as a more enlightened way. Whether they come to any success at that is debatable because most of the artists that I'm going to be talking about do not have much of an influence past 1930 because of Stalinist era repressions. But well, the books that we're looking at here are very interesting in terms of the way that they categorize, delineate, and perpetuate racist and colonial tropes, the tropes of the colonizers, the tropes of the empire that they inherited from the Russian Empire. And these illustrations, they take pains to carefully. So I'm actually going to move to the next one. And so, let's start, start with bows and arrows. And the first example comes from this Deity Narod of Mira, the Folk Children of the World, which was illustrated by two artists, Mikhail Yazuchevsky and Vasily Vatagin. So the first example, I'm going to show you some bow and arrow with these America little Indians by the fire. This was one page from this book. It's I think it has about 10 pages of illustrations in it. And many of these illustrations do try to depict the children's environment, but they also pay equal attention to material objects of children's play. And so certain genres of objects, such as these weapons, we'll also look at some modes of transport, and they represent cross-cultural visual connections between the playful activities of children from several diverse, quote-unquote, primitive or traditional cultures. And so we see here bows and arrows appearing in this image, and also in the images of in Dieti Negro, the children of Negroes. And again, I should probably put a trigger warning at the beginning of these presentations, because there's so many racist tropes that get perpetuated in these books. And of course, all of Africa is subjugated under the label of Negroes and at this point in era, which is obviously highly problematic. We see bow and arrow also in this book, similar illustrated by the same two illustrators. And then we also see it in the USSR in this same set of two illustrators. They were actually working out of the Darwin Museum in Moscow. And in this book, we see the Tungus boy is showing him with a bow and arrow. So we see bows and arrows appearing across multiple different cultures. And just in case you're not sure where Tungusic territories were, this approximately is where it's a very wide label that was applied to a variety of peoples that is not particularly accurate, but this is the geographic area we're looking at. We also see a bow and arrow appear in Kyrgyzstan with this illustration from Dieti Narodov by Olga Bonch-Osmolovskaya, which was probably published in 1929 from my research, I can tell. And we see this Kyrgyz boy shooting a bow and arrow at a bird in the sky. And here's Kyrgyzstan on the map. So those are bows and arrows. We see other weapons in these, but bows and arrows are the most common, but we see a boomerang here in Australia. And then also you see a machete with on the other side of the second little boy sitting next to the fire. So those are our bows and arrows. Now, modes of transport. We see a couple different examples of boats that appear in these books, and they're kind of a subset within a larger theme of playful modes of transportation. So we see boats here in the Ostiak page from the Children of the USSR. In the background, the young boy has caught his fish. And Ostiak is the territory. Ostiak was a very wide label applied to a number of groups of different peoples. The Khanty, the Ket, and the Selkup all were kind of lumped into this label of Ostiak, and they were in this territory of Siberia. Very wide territory, lots of different people involved, and all kind of lumped into this label of Ostiak, which this book perpetuated through this categorization of this boy and his boat. But we also see a boat in the back in Bonch-Osmolovskaya's illustrations of the Chinese children and catching a turtle. So boats appear in multiple different locations, but they're not the only form of transport. We see an ostrich pulled cart, for example, also this is the same book. Bonch-Osmolovskaya, half of the book is international, and half of the book is USSR territories. So we get 4 images from each. And here you see her samoyedi, her samoyed image on the top is her depiction of the sled that the samoyed would use, the samoyed children would use as transport. And so that's one of the internal USSR territories included in her book, and then also Vatakin and Jezichevsky's illustration of the same people, the Samoyed. Oh, and I don't have a map of them. I'm sorry. I should have a map of Samoyed, but I don't. And we even see airplanes, and this is a book that I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about, but maybe in the chat we can talk about. This is another book called Yetki Nazno Svietki, and if you look closely at the cover, you can see how aggressively, blatantly, outrageously, offensively racist these illustrations are. This one of the boy on his airplane, the Soviet boy on his airplane, is not. It's the not ugly side of racism, the side of the colonizer descending upon the world, the savior of the world. That's the narrative of the colonizer, right? So here he is on his airplane. So it's one more mode of transportation that we see in these books of material culture. Interestingly, in the early Soviet era, a student pointed this out to me just last week, where we see a lot of examples, we see a lot of representations of airplanes, and so often the figures that are depicted at the same time are very, very white-skinned children of blonde hair, which is very interesting. All right, anyway, last category of material culture of toys, which I think is particularly potentially has some interesting correspondences with the last two papers, are pipes. So we see pipes appear. They're the only musical instruments that appear in these books. We don't see any other musical instruments, only pipes. And they only appear in two different books on pages illustrating Ukraine and Belarus, these two contiguous colonized nations, colonized by the Soviets and by the Russian Empire. So in Bonto Smolovskaya's book on the Ukrainian page, we see this small boy down here. He is playing his pipe below the sunflowers. Interestingly, the image of Ukraine from Yezhevsky and Vatakin does not include a pipe player, but here's in there in case you need a reminder of where Ukraine is, since everyone should remember that at this point in time. And then, but their illustration of the Belarusian boy does have a boy playing probably a very similar manner of pipe. It's depicted very differently. It looks like a flute here with the Ukrainian boy, but it was actually labeled in the text here as a zhaleka. From the Belarusian, which was it's a instrument that is common in folk culture in Belarus and Ukraine, and so we see them in these two contiguous Soviet colonized nations in these two images. Oh, and there's Belarus in case you need to remember where Belarus is. I'll go back to this for a minute. These representations of folk material culture can be contextualized within broader context of shifting Soviet nationality policies in the late 1920s and 1930s. We see Soviet ethnographers are doing a lot of research. There's a lot of map making exercise, a lot of map making, trying to compartmentalize and chart the vast territories of the former Russian Empire. And these map makers and ethnographers are having a lot of interactions with ethnographic museums and working at ethnographic museums, telling ethnographic museums, helping them understand how to present the material culture that the ethnographic museums have within their collections, how to present it to the public. And then the curators that they're playing, all of these people are playing important roles in political shifts. And indeed, all the three of the illustrators that I've shown you here, Jezichevsky, Vatakin, they worked at the Darwin Museum in Moscow, which was the primary ethnographic museum in Moscow. And then Bonto Smolovskaya, she worked at the ethnographic department of the State Russian Museum in Leningrad, which later became a museum in its own right, but at this point in time was just a part of the State Russian Museum. And she created exhibition displays, monumental backdrops for exhibitions that would display these sort of objects of material culture. And so thus these artists, they had direct access to the objects of material culture that have been archived within these collections, and the picture books provided insight into how this early Soviet era defined this diversity of folk and traditional cultures through everyday objects within and beyond the confines of museum collections, within and beyond the confines of the borders of the Soviet Empire. Thank you very much.